Okay, ladies, so this is the secondary set of notes that I have. It looks just like the first set of notes, but this is going to follow the rise, the height, and the decline of the Renaissance, but through a literature lens. So I'm not doing the historical side, I'm doing it based on what kind of literature was built through this time period. So it's still the Renaissance, 1500 to 1650, and it's going to mirror what I just did in the last video. So let's look at the rise here. Remember from the history, the rise of the Renaissance was the Tudor kings, both Henry VII and Henry VIII and all of his wives. So during that time, we started to see the budding of the sonnet. Okay, the sonnet is the first form of literature that came out of the Renaissance. A sonnet is a poem. It's 14 lines. It's usually a tribute to a lady, someone so wonderful, so perfect that the author can never possess her. Here's where we get into some important pieces that you're actually going to have to remember. So there are a couple types of sonnets. One, they each have two names. So the first one is the Italian sonnet or the Petrarchan sonnet, named after Petrarch. Or we have the English sonnet, which could also be the English Anglican sonnet, or the Shakespearean sonnet, because he is the one who made them famous. All right, so the difference between them is the structure. They both have 14 lines. They both were, the first form of literature to come out of the Renaissance. They both are a tribute to a lady, but their format and setup is different. So if we're looking at the Italian sonnet, it is broken really into two parts, the 14 lines. It's broken into the first 8 lines with an rhyme scheme of A's and B's, with the A rhyming with the A, the B rhyming with the B. And the 8 lines are called an octave, obviously. Octagon, octopus, right? All stemming from the number 8. The second set of lines, you have 6 lines left to form 14 lines. So the 6 lines are called the sestet, and it has a rhyme scheme with C's and D's. So none of the second set of lines rhymes with the first 8 set of lines. Okay, the second structure is the English sonnet, the Shakespearean sonnet, and we're going to read some of these particularly, but this is built into 4-line parts. The quatrain, it has 3 quatrains and 1 couplet. Again, because it's a sonnet, it needs to add up to 14 lines. When we're looking at the English sonnet, if we take it as quatrain by quatrain, again with the rhyme scheme, the first 4 lines are A, B, A, B rhyme scheme. The second 4 lines go into C, D, C, D rhyme scheme. Third quatrain is E, F, E, F. And then, of course, the couplet rhymes with each other, being both G rhymes. All right, so those are what I tend to have you, I guess, memorize or really get to know, the 2 different kinds of sonnets and their formats. Okay, the sonnets in England were introduced mainly by 2 men, which was Thomas Wyatt and Henry Surrey. But we know mostly that Shakespeare became very famous for writing sonnets. Okay, the second type of literature during the rise, with the Henry Tudors ruling, was the native drama, all about England. Native meaning native to the country. Dramas, of course, are plays. This is the second form of literature from the Renaissance. Now, they already had dramas. Writing a play wasn't new, right? We had Antigone way back with the Greeks. Now it's just where they're flourishing. People are writing them. 3 different kinds of examples have the morality plays where, they put on a little play to show people how to act. They pick, whether it's honor, loyalty, different things about your morality. The second was miracle plays, mostly focused around the miracle of Christ. And then third were called interludes. These were very small 1-act plays, like dinner plays. You would sit at a big dinner, waiting and waiting for, it's like a wedding, going to these big fancy dinners. And then while you're waiting for the next course or for dishes to be cleared, you would have these little 1-act plays. All right, so now we move into the height of the Renaissance, keeping in mind that Elizabeth I is now ruler during this time, and she was very much a fan of flourishing literature and the arts, etc. So what we're going to look at here is courtier poets, right? They were in the court of England. They were brought into the court. They were sponsored to be paid to do their art in the court of the Renaissance. All right, so I'm going to give you a lot of names throughout this. I'm not going to ask you, obviously you need to know Shakespeare and maybe one other name, but these listing of names, don't worry too much about. But some examples of the courtier poets were Robert Devereux, Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Philip Sidney, and Edmund Spenser. And his famous poem is The Faerie Queen. But in our course, we're not actually going to read any poems by these authors, per se, us. During the height, the second was this continued support for these sonnets, and again, Shakespeare blossoming through writing his sonnets at this time. The third kind of literature we have are lyric poems, mostly written by Thomas Champion, and they were a little bit like love songs, not like our ballads that we talked about before, but more lovey than country music. Then we again have more continued dramas being produced. Shakespeare bringing in the Globe Theater and arranging these men to become actors and start performing the dramas that he was writing. We also have Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson at this time. Now, these three men worked really well together in creating great literature during this time period. Now, I have a note here right under the last item about looking forward to the end of the Renaissance here. At that time, the Globe Theater will be closed because we have this influx of Puritans. Now, the Puritans were not fans of drinking or entertainment or parties. They really wanted you to work, you to pray, maybe to journal. But the Puritans, they dressed in drab colored clothing, browns and whites and blacks, and they did not partake in any entertainment enjoyment. So the Globe Theater will eventually be shut down for a while because of these people. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the Stuart Kings, the decline of the Renaissance, the end of this season that we're looking at. We're going to move into what is called metaphysical poetry during this time period. Now, our main metaphysical poet that we read in Brit is John Donne. We do read, I hope we can read 3 pieces from him. One is called Song. It's a very short poem about finding love. The second one is called A Valediction, Forbidding Mourning, and it's this beautiful poem about John Donne's love for his wife. And then he becomes, after his wife dies, he becomes a preacher and he writes meditations. So we'll read Meditation 17. These metaphysical poets were very spiritual and intellectual. So the idea of metaphysical, rising above and beyond the very physical, thinking about poems where maybe you write a poem like your eyes are as lovely as the stars and your cheeks are roses, right? That's very physical, very, very, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what those kinds of poems mean. It's spelled out for you. But John Donne and some of his fellow poets wrote this spiritual, intellectual poetry, which was a lot more difficult to understand. It's a little more intellectual than romantic, yet it is also romantic. And I will prove you that when we read one of my favorite poems, which is The Valediction. They came up with this idea, if you notice here, it's in this red box. It's called a conceit. Now, I know you know what a metaphor is, but a conceit is basically taking a metaphor and extending it over multiple stanzas or possibly an entire poem. So if you take a comparison, so a metaphor is comparing 2 things that really don't go together that well. But you put 2 things that don't go together that well, and then you expand on them to create this literary visual image or this thought over an entire poem or a stanza. It's called a conceit. That is something you need to know. At this point in the decline, poetry became very polarized, maybe split into a couple different groups. We have the Cavalier poets, which basically nodded to the royalty or the kings and wrote poems about them to gain favor. Or you had these metaphysical poets who were a little more introspective, a little more cynical. The second type of literature in the decline was this King James Bible. So King James, who we talked about, Stuart, he ordered a new Bible to be written, mostly because the original Bible was just really too hard for people to read. So he wanted a lesser version, a translated, easier to read version. Now, you sometimes will find a King James Bible like in a hotel room. You know, if you open the drawer next to the bed, you might find the King James Bible there. It's very accessible to read. More people were able to read it, which is what they wanted. The third item here, again, continuing with dramas. They were Shakespeare's men were called the King's Men. By this point in time, they were so popular that Shakespeare was kind of able to make a living on his own. He wasn't sponsored by the kingdom anymore. He was able to be paid to be an actor and his men. Then we have John Milton, who wrote an epic poem. His poem was called Paradise Lost, and it's considered the greatest poem in the English language. Now, our poems that you know of, like Beowulf or the Odyssey, they were written down as stories that were orally told somewhere along the line. This poem was so great because John Milton sat down and said to himself, I'm going to write an epic poem. I'm just going to do it. I'm going to think of a topic and I'm going to write about it. Some of his topics that he considered writing about were Samson and Delilah. He actually thought about writing about Macbeth, which we're going to read, but he settled on Paradise Lost, which is about Adam and Eve in the kingdom of, the Garden of Eden, and how they get kicked out and they lose God's faith. And then lastly, essays were invented at the end of the Renaissance by Sir Francis Bacon. Now, you can thank him for you having to write essays. So they originally started by Francis Bacon saying, you know what, I want to know more about this topic. Why don't I think about it, research it, look it up, talk about it, and then write a little thing about it? So it became an essay. So thank you, Francis Bacon, for that. Okay, so this is all done in one video, which is great. And look back over these because we'll probably have a quiz. Thanks.